In court, my aunt presented her invoice for raising me after died, food, clothes, shelter, all itemized at $30,000. The judge read it carefully, then asked, "Where's the $280,000 in Social Security benefits you collected?" The courtroom erupted. Ethan Walker was 9 years old when everything he knew shattered in a single silent instant. One rainy Tuesday morning, a tractor-trailer jackknifed on Interstate 70 and collided with his mother's sedan. The police report said she died on impact. Ethan, sitting in the back seat with a seatbelt tightly across his chest, survived with a fractured arm and a lingering, unnameable hollowness. He didn't speak much for days after that. Just sat, his small frame dwarfed by the hospital bed, staring at the rain outside. He had no siblings. His father had never been part of the picture. And so, with no other immediate family, custody was granted to the only blood relative who stepped forward, Angela Walker, his mother's older sister. Angela lived on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, in a modest single-story house surrounded by chain-link fences and neat rows of hedges. She was in her mid-40s, unmarried, and had spent most of her adult life working as an administrative assistant at a local insurance office. To the outside world, she was disciplined, responsible, even generous for stepping up to raise her nephew. But inside those walls, Ethan would quickly learn that love, at least the kind he had known, was no longer part of the equation. The transition was immediate and jarring. Gone were the warm breakfasts and bedtime stories. Gone were the spontaneous hugs and impromptu movie nights with his mom. In their place came structure, silence, and the ever-present sensation that he was, above all, a burden. Angela was not cruel in the overt sense. There were no bruises, no shouting matches, no punishments that crossed legal lines. But she ruled the house like a ledger. Rules were strict and non-negotiable. Lights out at 8 o'clock. No dessert unless dishes were washed. No talking back, no, but I don't want to, and certainly no crying. If Ethan wept at night, he learned to do it into his pillow, muffling every sob. By the time he turned 10, she had implemented a weekly chore chart. Vacuuming laundry, cleaning the bathroom. "You live here, you contribute," she'd say. At 11, he had his own bank account, into which Angela deposited a small allowance, $5 a week, minus deductions for misbehavior, broken dishes, or forgotten tasks. Every dollar was documented in a little notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, right next to the coupons and spare keys. Despite the rigid atmosphere, Ethan tried to stay invisible. He did well in school, kept his grades high, made himself useful. But nothing he did ever seemed to soften Angela's demeanor. Praise was rare, affection non-existent. On his 12th birthday, she gave him a $20 bill and told him to buy himself something useful. That was the entire celebration. He didn't know then that Angela was receiving monthly survivor benefits from the government on his behalf. Money meant to ensure he had a stable upbringing after losing a parent. All he knew was that everything came with a price, whether spoken or unspoken. At school, he never talked about home. He learned to smile when people asked how he was doing and to nod politely when teachers complimented his resilience. "You're so mature for your age," they'd say. He'd nod again, biting back the desire to scream. Being mature was not a choice. It was survival. There were moments, of course, where he let himself dream. Quiet moments under the covers with a flashlight and a borrowed library book, or fleeting daydreams in the back of the school bus. He imagined a life where someone made pancakes on Sundays, where laughter wasn't a currency to be earned. He missed his mother with a depth that words couldn't reach. In his room, he kept a shoebox under the bed, filled with what Lily had left of her, an old perfume bottle, a pair of earrings, a photo of them at the zoo. He would take it out on particularly hard nights and hold the items like talismans, as if their presence might tether him to a world that no longer existed. Time passed. Seasons changed. Ethan grew taller, quieter. By the time he reached high school, he had mastered the art of emotional minimalism. He had friends, but kept them at arm's length. He participated in school activities, but never invited anyone over. He never spoke of his aunt. And yet, beneath the surface, he was paying attention. He remembered the things Angela said when she thought he wasn't listening. The muttered complaints about how expensive he was. The offhand comments to neighbors about how she was raising someone else's child for free. He absorbed it all, filing each word away, though he didn't yet know why. By the age of 16, Ethan had a part-time job at a bookstore downtown. He saved every penny, not because he had a plan, but because saving made him feel like he had some control. At 18, he graduated with honors. He got a scholarship to a local college. And though it didn't cover everything, he took out loans and worked nights to fill the gap. Angela didn't come to his graduation. She said she had a dentist appointment. At 19, he moved out. No goodbye, no farewell dinner, no words of encouragement. Just a cold Saturday morning with 2 suitcases and a bus ticket. Angela stood at the doorway as he left, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "You owe me," she said, just before the door closed. He didn't answer, and yet he would soon learn that she had meant it literally. Ethan was 20 years old when he first heard Angela use the word debt in a way that made his skin crawl. It wasn't shouted or thrown like a weapon. It was quiet, offhand, almost casual. He had come back to her house for the weekend to pick up a few boxes he had left behind, old books and clothes he hadn't needed since moving into his tiny college apartment. The air was heavy with the sterile scent of pine sol, just like he remembered. Nothing had changed. The plastic covering still clung to the couch cushions, and the television was tuned to a local news channel with the volume too low to hear. Angela didn't greet him when he walked in. She just pointed toward the garage and told him, "The boxes are where you left them." He hadn't intended to stay long, but as he packed, he overheard her in the kitchen, speaking to Mrs. Delaney, the neighbor from 2 doors down. The walls were thin, and their voices carried easily through the hallway. "Well, he's back to collect more what I gave him," Angela said, her voice a mix of bitterness and pride. "I raised that boy like he was mine, and what do I get in return? Nothing. But one day, he'll repay every cent. You watch. He owes me." Mrs. Delaney murmured something in response, but Ethan didn't catch it. His heartbeat drowned out the rest. "Owes me." That phrase stuck to him like grease. It wasn't the first time Angela had made him feel like a guest in her house, or like a tenant rather than family. But this was the first time she had openly spoken about him as a liability, as someone with a ledger to balance. He didn't say anything then. He just tightened the straps on the box he was carrying and walked out without another word. She didn't follow him, but the moment lingered. Back at his apartment, Ethan began to wonder what exactly Angela thought she was owed. He knew she had never spent money on anything extravagant for him. His clothes were always basic, his meals functional. Even his school supplies were secondhand or dollar store items. She hadn't paid for his college, hadn't sent care packages, hadn't visited once. What debt could she possibly imagine he owed? Then, one evening, while scrolling through social media, he came across a story about foster care fraud. A woman in another state had been charged with misusing survivor benefits meant for her niece. The headline was vague, but the details were familiar. Monthly checks, legal guardianship, and an eventual reckoning. Ethan read the article twice, his pulse rising. Survivor benefits. The term stirred something. Hadn't there been envelopes back when he was a kid? Official-looking mail with the government seal. Always addressed to Angela? The memory was faint, but was there white envelopes, blue lettering, the word Social Security Administration stamped at the top. He remembered once asking what they were for, and Angela snapping back, "None of your business." Grown-up stuff. He hadn't questioned it then. He was just a kid. But now, things were starting to make sense, or at least starting to feel off. The next day, he made a quiet decision. He'd start keeping track. Every time Angela contacted him, which by now was rare, he'd take notes. If she mentioned money, if she made any reference to what she'd done for him, he'd document it. Not out of spite, but because something in his gut told him the story she'd been telling herself wasn't the whole truth. And then, almost a year later, he got the letter. It arrived in a thick white envelope with his full name printed in block letters across the front. Inside was a formal notice, bearing the seal of the Franklin County Family Court. He was being summoned. The sender, Angela Walker. At first, he thought it was a mistake. but the contents were clear. Angela had filed a civil claim against him. In it, she outlined expenses incurred for the full-time care, supervision, and provision of basic necessities for Ethan Walker during the years 2009 through 2018. She was requesting repayment in the amount of $30,000. Attached was a multi-page invoice, broken down by category. Rent, $800 per year. Food, $3,000 annually. Clothing, toiletries, electricity, school supplies, each item with an annual estimate and a total amount. It was all calculated, totaled, and signed at the bottom, as if he were a client who had failed to pay for services rendered. There was no letter, no explanation, just the paperwork. Ethan stared at the pages, numb. The audacity of it wasn't even the most painful part. It was the clarity. For Angela, his entire childhood had been a transaction. Every bowl of cereal, every t-shirt, every night under her roof. It had all been accounted for, not out of duty or compassion or even familial obligation, but as a long-term loan. He took the papers to his roommate, Jonah, a third-year law student. Jonah flipped through them with a frown. She actually filed this? Jonah asked, eyebrows raised. This isn't a joke? No joke, Ethan said quietly. This is insane. You were a minor. She was your legal guardian. I know. Jonah leaned back in his chair, exhaling. You need legal help, man. This isn't just wrong. It might be illegal on her part, especially if she was collecting survivor benefits. That phrase again. Survivor benefits. The next morning, Ethan called the local Social Security office. The process was slow and the answers vague at first, but after several calls, a lot of waiting, he finally got confirmation. Following his mother's death, a monthly survivor benefit had indeed been issued in his name, payable to his legal guardian, Angela Walker. The representative couldn't share the total amount without more paperwork, but even that small confirmation shifted the ground beneath Ethan's feet. It meant there was a trail. It meant there were numbers. And it meant she had lied, by omission, by intention, or both. He requested a full benefits history. It would take time. Meanwhile, the court date loomed. One night, unable to sleep, he returned to his childhood home, not to see Angela, but to search. He waited until she left for work, then used the spare key she probably didn't know he still had. The house was exactly as he remembered. Neat, cold controlled. In the basement, behind a stack of boxes filled with old Christmas decorations, he found a locked cabinet. He jimmied it open with a screwdriver. Inside were binders. Lots of them. Most were labeled with mundane things, taxes, insurance, warranties. But one binder stood out. SSA, Ethan. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside were printed statements, monthly deposit records, handwritten notes, even a spreadsheet meticulously updated, listing every deposit from the Social Security Administration over a 10-year period. Ethan sat on the floor, binder in his lap, doing the math. $280,000. That was the amount Angela had received. $280,000 to care for him. She had never told him. And now, she was suing him for $30,000 more. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat there, the weight of a decade pressing down on him. This wasn't just about money. It never had been. It was about the lies she had told him his entire life. That he was a burden, that he cost her everything. But the numbers didn't lie. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped between utility bills and grocery store flyers, its plain white envelope bearing the unmistakable weight of something that wasn't meant to be ignored. Ethan almost threw aside with the junk mail, but the embossed return address caught his eye. Walker and Langston Attorneys at Law. He knew the name. Angela had mentioned them before. Family friends? Or more precisely, a friend of her late employer who now did the occasional favor for her. He opened the envelope slowly, cautiously, as if it might bite. Inside was a neatly typed, 3-page letter written in formal legal language that felt both cold and personal at once. It outlined in meticulous detail the civil complaint Angela had filed. Her claim that as his legal guardian, she had provided full-time care, housing, and necessities for nearly 10 years without any financial support from Ethan himself. Therefore, she was entitled to reimbursement for the expenses she had incurred on his behalf. The firm's tone was careful, not aggressive, but not friendly either. The letter noted that Angela had gone above and beyond in her guardianship role, and that while she had never sought compensation during Ethan's childhood, she now sought a fair and reasonable settlement in recognition of the financial burden she bore. They offered to settle the matter outside of court if Ethan agreed to pay the $30,000 in question within 60 days. There was a sentence near the end that struck him harder than the others. While we understand Mr. Walker may feel emotionally conflicted about the matter, our client believes that recognition of her sacrifice is both morally and financially appropriate. Recognition, as if this were about respect or gratitude, as if demanding money from someone you raised was a symbol of maternal pride. He folded the letter and stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Jonah. "She's serious," Ethan said once Jonah answered. "She's really doing this." Jonah was silent for a beat. "You need a lawyer. Not me, a real one." "I can't afford." "I'll help you find someone. Pro bono. Legal aid. Something. This is messed up. Ethan, you don't fight this alone." They found a nonprofit legal clinic in downtown Columbus that specialized in family law. The following week, Ethan met with a young attorney named Cara Whitaker. She was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed and calm, with a calm energy that made Ethan feel like maybe for once he wasn't the one losing his grip. Cara read the letter, flipped to the court documents, and nodded slowly. "You're being sued for $30,000 by your aunt," she said, more confirmed than a question. "And you believe she received Social Security survivor benefits in your name?" "I have records, bank statements, a binder full of deposits. It adds up to $280,000. Cara's eyebrows lifted, but her voice remained measured. "If that's true, this isn't just about defending yourself against her claim. It may involve fraud, misuse of federal funds, especially if the money wasn't used exclusively for your care." Ethan hesitated. "Is that criminal?" "It can be, but let's not jump ahead. First, we gather evidence. You're not paying her a dime until we establish the full picture." They spent the next few weeks building his case. Ethan brought in everything he had: the binder from the basement, the SSA letters he managed to recover, photos of his old room, and notes he had taken over the years, memories, overheard comments, moments that now seem more like clues and anecdotes. Cara cross-referenced everything, pulled public records, and filed a formal request to the Social Security Administration for the full benefit disbursement history under Angela Walker's guardianship. In the meantime, the legal process moved forward. Ethan was formally served. A court date was set, just 6 weeks away. He began preparing himself for the possibility that he would have to face her again in the same room under the cold fluorescent lights of a courtroom. He hadn't seen Angela since the day he retrieved his boxes. And now, she was summoning him not as family, but as a debtor. The irony was unbearable. One afternoon, as he sat across from Cara reviewing timelines and evidence, she looked up from her notes. "Ethan, I have to ask, what do you want out of this, beyond winning the case?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want her to admit what she did. I want the truth to be on record." Cara nodded. "And if she doesn't, then I want the judge to see who she really is." The Social Security Administration responded 2 weeks later. Their records confirmed that Angela had received monthly benefits on Ethan's behalf from the month following his mother's death until the month he turned 18. The exact total, $279,612. The numbers aligned perfectly with Angela's own records. What didn't align was how that money was spent. Cara had asked Ethan to start listing every major item or expense he remembered receiving. It was a short list: basic school supplies, department store clothes, cheap furniture, no private tutors, no summer camps, no medical treatments outside routine checkups. Certainly no vacations or luxury items. She claimed she spent $30,000, Cara said during one prep meeting, which implies the remaining $250,000 is unaccounted for. Ethan nodded. "She remodeled the kitchen once. Bought a new car around the time I started high school." Cara leaned back, thoughtful. "If she spent those funds on anything other than your care, it could be considered misappropriation. The judge might not pursue criminal charges, but at the very least, it destroys her case against you. The court date grew closer. Ethan barely slept the night before. He kept replaying every moment from his childhood that now seemed poisoned, every quiet dinner, every forced thank you. Every time he'd been made to feel like an unwanted guest in his own life. He walked into the courtroom, wearing a borrowed suit. Kara stood beside him, organized and unfazed. Angela was already seated across the aisle, dressed in a navy blue blazer and holding a thick folder. Her lawyer, an older man with silver hair and a too-wide smile, nodded politely to the judge as proceedings began. Angela didn't look at Ethan. The opening statements were standard. Angela's attorney repeated the claims. She had raised Ethan out of duty and sacrifice, and now simply wanted to be compensated for years of unpaid effort. He spoke about moral obligation and financial fairness. He painted Angela as a woman who had done the right thing, but was now seeking rightful recognition. When it was Kara's turn, she stood and presented the facts. Clear, direct, and damning. The SSA benefits, the deposit history, the binder, the total amount, nearly $300,000. She didn't make it emotional. She let the numbers speak for themselves. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, she said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff is not seeking compensation for unpaid care. She is attempting to collect twice, once from the federal government, and now again from the very person she claimed to be supporting. That is not justice. That is exploitation." Ethan watched Angela's jaw tighten. She still hadn't looked at him. When the judge called for submission of evidence, Kara handed over the binder, the statements, and the SSA confirmation letter. The judge flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. Ethan sat still, heart pounding, watching the man who now held the power to unravel a decade of silence. The judge said nothing at first. He read, turned pages, made notes. Then he looked up and asked the question that would turn everything. "Mrs. Walker, where's the total amount of survivor benefits, approximately $280,000, you received as Mr. Walker's legal guardian?" Angela blinked. For the first time that day, she turned to look at Ethan, and she said nothing. The silence in the courtroom after the judge's question felt as if the very air had thickened. Angela stared at the judge with the brittle composure of someone caught off guard, her mouth slightly open, her fingers tightening around the edge of her folder. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering something outside his mouth, but she didn't respond immediately. The judge, an older man with a calm but piercing demeanor, removed his reading glasses and looked directly at her, waiting. "Mrs. Walker?" he repeated, not harshly, but with the unmistakable edge of expectation. Angela finally spoke. Her voice was low, rehearsed, mechanical. "The money was used for his care, Your Honor. Housing, food, clothing, school-related expenses." The judge raised an eyebrow. "All $280,000? Angela hesitated. "Yes, over the course of 10 years. There was a pause. Then the judge turned to Kara. "Ms. Whitaker, how much does your client estimate was spent directly on his care during those years?" Kara stood. "We estimate no more than $30,000 to $40,000 in basic necessities, Your Honor. The plaintiff's own invoice supports that figure. The remainder, we believe, was used for personal expenses unrelated to Mr. Walker's upbringing." The judge nodded. "I'll need time to review the documents. For now, we'll adjourn." The gavel struck once, but it echoed like thunder. Outside the courtroom, Ethan stood under the gray Ohio sky, watching people disperse across the steps of the courthouse. His legs felt heavy, and his mind buzzed with everything unsaid. Kara stood beside him, her phone in one hand, her briefcase in the other. She lied. Ethan said quietly, as if still trying to convince himself. Kara didn't respond immediately. She looked out at the passing traffic. "She's trying to make this about gratitude, as if raising you was a favor she should be paid for. It wasn't a favor. It was supposed to be family." Ethan didn't go home right away. Instead, he walked for almost an hour through the side streets of downtown Columbus, passing the old brick buildings and the steady thrum of afternoon life. He stopped at a coffee shop and sat alone in the back, replaying the judge's question again and again in his mind. It had cracked something open, not just in the courtroom, but in him. For years, he had carried guilt he couldn't name. A quiet voice that whispered, maybe she was right. Maybe he had been too much. Maybe he owed her something. But now, with the documents on a record and the lies unraveling, the weight began to shift. What he owed wasn't money. What he owed was to himself, a truth he had never dared to speak aloud. That evening, back in his apartment, he sat at his small desk and opened his laptop. He pulled up a blank document and started typing. At first, it was disjointed. A few sentences, then whole paragraphs. Memories, dates, pieces of evidence. Not legal statements, not testimony. Just the story as he remembered it, as he had lived it. He wrote through the night. By dawn, he had 8 pages of raw narrative, painful and unpolished. It wasn't for the court. Not yet. It was for him. To untangle the knots that Angela had tied so tightly around his childhood. 2 days later, Kara called with news. The judge is requesting a second hearing. He wants a full financial disclosure from Angela. Every expense, every withdrawal. He's also requested that we provide any supporting material that shows how the benefits were used or misused. Ethan nodded, already anticipating what needed to be done. I'll go through the rest of the binder. There might be more. There was, in the back of one folder, tucked behind a stack of bank statements. Ethan found receipts, dozens of them. New appliances, home improvement projects, furniture purchases. A cruise booking dated the summer before he turned 16. The name on the reservation was Angela's and no one else's. He scanned and labeled everything, then brought it to Kara. This is more than enough, she said after reviewing the files. It's not just evidence. It's a pattern. Ethan sat across from her in silence, then finally asked a question that had haunted him since the first letter. Can we do more than defend? Can we countersue? Kara looked at him carefully. You want to file a claim against her? She took money that was meant for me, lied about it, tried to take more. If we don't push back, she'll just keep doing this. To someone else somehow. Kara leaned back, folded her arms. There's precedent for restitution in these cases, especially if we can prove misuse of federal funds. We'd have to show intent, not just mismanagement. I have 10 years of intent, Ethan said, and she put it in writing. The decision was made. They filed the countersuit 2 weeks later. The claim was straightforward. Financial exploitation, misappropriation of federal survivor benefits, and emotional distress resulting from prolonged financial manipulation. Ethan didn't expect to get the money back, though part of him couldn't deny the hope. What he wanted, more than anything, was accountability. When the documents were served, Angela's response was swift and vicious. She denied everything, accused Ethan of betrayal, and claimed the countersuit was a cruel punishment against the woman who gave him a home. Her lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, but the judge denied it. The second hearing was set. This time, the courtroom felt different. The balance had shifted. Angela no longer sat with the cool confidence she'd worn before. Her eyes darted from page to page as her lawyer scrambled to explain the discrepancies in the financial records. Kara, calm as ever, presented each receipt, each statement, each line of deposit. The narrative was simple and damning. Angela had been entrusted with responsibility and had used that trust to enrich herself, while telling Ethan, year after year, that he was a burden. Then came Ethan's turn to speak. He stood slowly, hands trembling slightly as he held his prepared statement. The judge gave him a nod, and he began. For most of my life, I believed I owed my aunt something. She reminded me often, through words, silence, and everything in between, that I was a cost, an obligation. I accepted that. I thought maybe it was true. But what I didn't know was that the government had already provided for my care, that my mother had left behind something to support me. And instead of telling me that, my aunt took it all and then asked for more. He paused, the courtroom silent around him. I'm not here because I want revenge. I'm here because I want the truth on the record, because no one else stood up for me when I was a child. So I'm standing up now. The judge listened intently. When Ethan finished, he gave a small nod and turned to Angela. Mrs. Walker, do you wish to respond? Angela said nothing. Her lawyer whispered urgently. Still, she remained silent. The judge cleared his throat and turned back to his bench. Very well. I'll review the full case and issue a decision in due course. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan stayed behind for a moment, watching as Angela exited without looking back. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired, but for the first time in years, he also felt light. He had stood up, he had spoken, and whatever came next, the truth was no longer hidden. It had been nearly a month since the second court hearing. The waiting period for the judge's ruling was officially underway, but Ethan could feel the invisible weight of the system pressing on his shoulders. Every day that passed without a verdict felt like a reminder of how long the truth had been buried. The public face of the case, what had been said in court, was already enough to rattle Angela's carefully constructed image. But Ethan had a nagging feeling that there was more buried beneath the surface, something neither side had yet uncovered, and he couldn't shake it. One Sunday afternoon, with the autumn wind rolling crisp through the city, Ethan found himself back in front of Angela's house. He hadn't planned to go. He had been driving with no destination, and the car seemed to pull him there on its own. He parked a few houses down and stared at the aging brick facade, the same porch light that flickered when he was 13 still fluttering weakly in the late-day sun. Angela had moved out temporarily, likely to avoid reporters and neighbors. There were rumors floating online now, thanks to leaked court documents and whispers through social media. Her name had started appearing in posts about financial abuse, orphan minors, and the misuse of government aid. Ethan didn't engage with any of it publicly, but he read everything. He needed to know how far the fallout was reaching. The front door was locked, of course, but the garage door code hadn't changed. He remembered it clearly, Angela's birthday in reverse. He typed the numbers slowly, heart pounding, and the door clicked open with a mechanical groan. Inside, the air smelled of dust and neglect. The shelves were cluttered with tools and used holiday decorations, and boxes labeled with years long gone. Ethan slipped inside, closed the door behind him, and made his way toward the basement entrance at the back. The stairs creaked under his weight, just like they always had. The basement was dim, lit only by a small, grimy window near the ceiling and a single overhead bulb that flickered when he pulled the chain. The room was unchanged, an old workbench on one side, rows of metal shelves lining the walls, and a pile of forgotten storage bins in the corner. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Kara had already submitted the financial records and documents they'd gathered, and the evidence was more than solid. But the feeling remained. There was something else here, something Angela had never intended anyone to see. He began checking the shelves, moving boxes, opening drawers. Most were filled with old tax returns, home warranties, instruction manuals from outdated electronics. Then he noticed a short metal filing cabinet tucked beneath the workbench. Its bottom drawer was slightly ajar, just enough to suggest someone had opened it hastily and never quite closed it again. Ethan knelt and pulled the drawer open. Inside was a thin stack of folders, each labeled by year. At first glance, they looked unremarkable, just old receipts, utility bills, and handwritten notes. But at the back of the drawer, he found a spiral-bound notebook. It was worn, the cover creased and stained, but what caught his eye was the first page. Monthly SSA budget, Ethan. His breath caught. He flipped through the pages. Each one was dated. There were rows and columns. Income, expenses, leftover amounts. But what made this notebook different from the other binder they had submitted was the level of detail. Angela had annotated the margins with personal notes, explanations, even commentary. Cut food budget this month. Use funds for patio project. Extra deposit from SSA. Ethan turned 13, payment adjusted. Used difference to cover furnace repair. Vacation fund, pulled from surplus. Ethan turned page after page, his eyes scanning the numbers. It wasn't just a record of expenses. It was a record of choices, documented proof that Angela had diverted money meant for him to improve her own life. And she had written it all down, almost proudly, as if budgeting misuse was a form of efficiency. But one page stood out. It was dated 3 months before Ethan's 18th birthday. At the top, written in red ink, were the words, "End of payments imminent. Plan B, legal reimbursement." Below that, a bullet list. Document yearly expenses. Create invoice. research minor to adult debt recovery, prepare narrative, sacrifice everything, consult Langston about legal route. Ethan stared at the list, stunned. The lawsuit hadn't been a reaction. It had been a plan, carefully drafted, premeditated, and preserved in ink long before he received the first letter. He flipped to the final pages. There were notes on Ethan's behavior. Cold, clinical assessments. Still quiet. Resentful. Doesn't ask for help. Seems independent. Won't challenge authority. No signs of legal knowledge. Should be manageable. He closed the notebook and sat on the cold basement floor, notebook resting on his knees. His pulse roared in his ears, his thoughts a blur of anger, disbelief, and something else, clarity. Angela had never seen him as a child. She had seen him as a transaction, a project to be managed, a source of income and later, of potential compensation. She had kept this notebook like a business ledger, confident that he would never find it, confident that he would never fight back. But now he had it. He took photos of every page with his phone, then carefully returned the notebook to the drawer exactly as he had found it. He didn't need Angela to know he had it. Not yet. Let her believe she still held the upper hand. Let her sit in silence while the court deliberated, thinking the worst was over. Back at Carr's office, he placed his phone on the desk and pulled up the photos. She planned it all, he said, handing it to her. Carra scrolled through the images in silence. Her face was unreadable, but when she reached the final pages, she looked up slowly. This changes everything, she said. We're not just talking about financial misuse now. This notebook shows premeditated fraud and manipulation. It confirms intent. If the judge sees this, he will... Ethan interrupted. Not yet, but soon. Carra nodded slowly. This will be the nail in the coffin. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Ethan looked at the digital scans again. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself to feel something like resolution. Not relief, not revenge, but the quiet, steady sense that justice was no longer a distant dream. It was moving closer, piece by piece, built not on rage but on truth. And the truth was now undeniable. The courthouse buzzed with restrained energy that morning, as if everyone inside could feel something looming, even if they couldn't name it. It was one of those rare days in Columbus when the sun had pushed its way through weeks of gray, casting sharp light through the tall windows lining the courtroom walls. Ethan arrived early, suit-pressed, hands steady despite the churn inside him. He had slept less than 4 hours, but his mind was alert, focused. Carra was already waiting inside, seated at their usual table with her notes neatly stacked, her expression calm but firm. She gave Ethan a small nod as he entered, and he returned it silently before sitting down. Neither of them needed to say much. Everything that needed to be said had already been captured in evidence, witness, and argument. Today was about the verdict. Across the aisle, Angela arrived 5 minutes before the hearing began, her lawyer at her side. She wore a muted gray dress, her hair pulled tight into a bun, makeup drawn to hide the shadows beneath her eyes. But Ethan could see it. Fatigue, uncertainty, the cracks forming behind a lifetime of control. She didn't look at him. Not once. The judge entered at 9 o'clock sharp. He carried no stack of papers this time, just a single file folder in his hand. He sat without preamble, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. This court has reviewed the documentation, testimonies, and evidence presented by both parties in the matter of Walker versus Walker. He began. His voice was measured, practiced, but there was a tension to it, an undercurrent of disapproval that neither lawyer could miss. Ethan's hands rested flat on the table. He didn't blink. The judge continued. The plaintiff, Ms. Angela Walker, has brought forth a civil claim seeking reimbursement in the amount of $30,000 for expenses allegedly incurred during her guardianship of Mr. Ethan Walker. While guardians are not automatically entitled to retroactive compensation for raising a minor, exceptions may apply in cases where financial hardship or lack of governmental support can be demonstrated. There was a pause, deliberate and heavy. In this case, however, the court finds that Ms. Walker received substantial financial assistance in the form of monthly Social Security survivor benefits intended specifically for the care and support of Mr. Walker. These benefits, totaling approximately $280,000, were dispersed regularly over a period of 10 years. Angela shifted slightly in her seat, a flicker of motion that betrayed her otherwise rigid posture. The plaintiff submitted an itemized invoice detailing expenses that, according to her, reflect the costs of raising Mr. Walker. However, this court has found inconsistencies between those stated expenses and the documented financial records, including multiple purchases, home improvements, and luxury expenditures unrelated to the minor's care. The judge picked up the folder, opened it slowly, and pulled out a single document. In addition, the court has reviewed a recently submitted notebook recovered from the plaintiff's private residence, containing detailed budget spreadsheets and personal annotations. These entries suggest not only a pattern of misappropriation, but also a premeditated strategy to seek additional compensation upon the expiration of benefit eligibility. Angela's lawyer tried to interject, "Your Honor, if I may," but the judge held up a hand without looking at him. "I will allow no interruptions. This court has reviewed the material in full." He turned back toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, your testimony was measured, direct, and supported by extensive evidence. This court finds no basis for the plaintiff's claim against you." Ethan exhaled slowly, silently. No reaction crossed his face. "Not yet." The judge turned to Angela next. "Ms. Walker, this court not only denies your request for compensation, but also finds sufficient grounds to question your use of federally issued survivor benefits intended for the welfare of your nephew. The court is referring this matter to the Social Security Administration for further investigation into potential fraud or misuse of government funds." Angela's face remained stone-like, but her hands had gripped the edge of the table tightly, knuckles pale. The judge closed the folder. As for the countersuit filed by Mr. Walker for financial exploitation and emotional distress, this court acknowledges a severe ethical breach demonstrated by the plaintiff's actions. However, without a full audit by federal investigators, the question of restitution remains outside the court's purview at this stage. Another pause. Therefore, this court rules as follows. All claims brought by Ms. Walker are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Walker is not liable for any amount claimed. The documentation pertaining to benefit misuse will be forwarded to the appropriate federal authorities. This case is closed. The gavel struck. The room was still. Ethan didn't move. Kara placed her hand gently on his arm. "It's done," she said quietly. Angela rose, stiff and slow, as though her body had turned to glass. Her lawyer tried to whisper something, but she ignored him, gathering her bag with mechanical precision. For one brief second, she turned to Ethan, but it wasn't a look of anger or regret. It was something colder, a recognition of loss, not just of the case, but the narrative she had constructed and believed would never be questioned. He returned her gaze, unflinching. She walked out without a word. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered. The case had drawn attention, especially after whispers of the financial records began to circulate online. As Kara and Ethan emerged into the sunlight, a few cameras clicked. Someone shouted Ethan's name. He kept walking. A reporter asked, "Do you feel vindicated, Ethan? What do you plan to do next?" He stopped, looked at her, then spoke slowly. "I didn't come here to win. I came to tell the truth. That's enough for now." He and Kara crossed the street, the courthouse shrinking behind them. That evening, back in his apartment, Ethan sat on the floor near the window, the first breath of real peace settling over him. He didn't feel joy. Not exactly. But something had been released, some long-held tension finally unwound. He wasn't the boy in that silent house anymore, counting coins, avoiding footsteps, mistaking control for care. He was something else now, and though he had no idea what came next, he knew one thing with certainty. He would never owe her anything again. The courtroom was quieter than usual that morning. No cameras, no reporters, no crowd waiting to spectate. Just the parties involved, a few clerks, and the steady hum of the building's old ventilation system. This wasn't a verdict day, nor a hearing to rule on motions. It was, on the surface, a procedural session. But for Ethan, it marked one of the most revealing moments of the entire ordeal. The judge had requested a private review of Angela's submitted documentation, the infamous invoice that had sparked the lawsuit in the first place. It was a document Angela herself had compiled, itemizing 10 years' worth of expenses she claimed to have spent raising Ethan. Breakfast, shoes, coats, rent, utilities, school supplies, every line meticulously priced and subtotaled. She had submitted it with a kind of pride, as if the neat columns and arithmetic would speak louder than any moral ambiguity. It was as Carr had described it, less a budget and more a statement of perceived ownership. Ethan and Carr sat on one side of the courtroom, Angela and her lawyer on the other. The judge sat with a folder in front of him, glasses low on his nose, a pen tapping slowly against the desk. He did not speak for several minutes. Instead, he leafed through the pages silently, one by one, as if rereading them for the third or fourth time. The room was so still that every turn of the page seemed amplified. Finally, he cleared his throat. "This invoice," he began, not lifting his eyes. "It is thorough." Angela straightened slightly, as if expecting acknowledgement. The judge looked up now, eyes sharp, too thorough. Angela's lawyer sat up. "Your Honor," the judge raised a hand. "No, you may respond after I finish." He picked up the first page of the invoice and held it slightly aloft. "This line item, breakfast daily, $2, multiplied by 365 days, then repeated for 10 years. That suggests you served Mr. Walker breakfast every single day without fail for a decade." Angela nodded slightly, not yet realizing the implication. The judge's tone remained measured. "Not one missed day? Not a single vacation, illness, or instance where breakfast was unavailable or skipped?" Her lawyer responded, "Your Honor, the estimate was meant to reflect consistency in support." "It is not an estimate," the judge interrupted. "It is presented as precise. That is my concern." He set the page down and turned to the next. "This one, clothing, $350 per year, every year. Again, presented as exact." He flipped another page. "Utilities, water, electricity, gas, each assigned an annual cost, yet not once fluctuating according to inflation, seasonal changes, or market variation. The numbers are neat, suspiciously neat." Angela's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The judge continued, "Now, if this were submitted as a general financial summary, the rigidity of the figures might be tolerable, but this document is labeled as an invoice. Invoices, by definition, are transactional. They represent an exchange of services rendered, usually between consenting parties. Was Mr. Walker ever made aware, during his time as a minor, that these services were accumulating as a debt?" Angela spoke now, voice steady but rehearsed. "I never kept a secret that I was making sacrifices. He knew I was struggling to support him." The judge leaned forward. "Struggle does not equal contract. You were his legal guardian. You received monthly government benefits in that capacity. And yet, this document makes no mention of those funds. Why?" Angela hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "Because they weren't part of this. They were the foundation of this." The judge snapped. "This entire arrangement, your guardianship, your financial responsibilities, and your access to federal support revolved around those funds. To separate them from this claim is not only misleading, but deliberately manipulative." There was a long silence. Ethan remained still, his expression unchanged, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. He wasn't surprised. Not anymore. But hearing the judge dissect the document, piece by piece, flaw by flaw, was still its own kind of indication. The judge wasn't finished. "I also noticed several anomalies here. For example, school fees, $200 per year, for every year. Yet according to Mr. Walker's educational records, he qualified for school lunch programs and fee waivers due to household income. So where did these fees originate?" Angela opened her mouth, then closed it again. The judge glanced at Kara. "Ms. Whitaker, has your client received any direct reimbursement from Ms. Walker or her legal team since the first ruling?" "No, Your Honor." "Have they attempted to settle privately or revise their initial claim?" "No, Your Honor." The judge leaned back in his chair. He held the invoice between two fingers, then placed it back inside the folder. "This is not an accounting document. It is an attempt to manufacture debt where none exists. And more than that, it is a distortion of familial duty, an effort to redefine parenting as a billable service, posthumously repackaged for profit. He looked at Angela one last time. You were given 10 years of resources. You accepted the responsibility of care. And now, you have attempted to rewrite that arrangement to your own advantage, hoping the court would endorse the fiction. He paused, then concluded with a single, chilling sentence. This invoice is inadmissible as a legal claim. It is also a moral failure. He closed the folder and adjourned the session. Outside the courtroom, Angela didn't linger. She passed by Ethan without a word, her eyes forward, her expression unreadable. Her lawyer followed in silence, his briefcase held like a shield. Kara exhaled softly, watching them leave. That's the last time she gets to hold this over your head, she said. Ethan didn't reply right away. He looked down at the courthouse steps, then up at the sky beyond them. She never cared what I felt, he said finally. She only cared about what she could prove, or thought she could. Kara glanced at him. She underestimated the one thing she couldn't control. What's that? You. 2 weeks had passed since the judge shredded Angela's so-called invoice in open court. The courtroom had gone silent that day, but outside those walls, the noise was only growing. Whispers spread through local news blogs, Reddit threads, and private Facebook groups. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, especially those who had known Angela from a neighborhood, from work, or from church. Ethan kept away from it all. He didn't need strangers debating whether he should be grateful for being clothed and fed, or whether Angela had committed outright fraud. He knew the truth. So did the court. The rest was noise. But one thing still remained unresolved. Proof of where the money went. The Social Security Administration had already acknowledged the total amount paid to Angela on Ethan's behalf. $279,612. Kara had submitted that confirmation. They had the handwritten notebook with Angela's annotations and her to-do list of how to monetize Ethan's existence once the benefits stopped. But what they didn't yet have was the final piece, the actual bank records that showed where the money landed and, more importantly, how it was spent. The court had issued a subpoena. Angela had fought it. Her attorney argued it was invasive, unnecessary, that the benefit had already been functionally audited through her budget notes. The judge disagreed. He ordered full disclosure of all personal and joint bank account statements tied to Angela Walker from the day she was granted custody of Ethan to the day he turned 18. The documents arrived at Kara's office in 2 heavy envelopes, one for each decade. She called Ethan immediately. There's something here, she said. Bring your laptop. They sat in her office for hours, surrounded by spreadsheets, scanned receipts, and printed bank statements. Kara had already started sorting the data, but there was too much for her team to finish alone. Ethan, having spent much of his college life working part-time at a local bookstore, had developed a quiet patience for tasks like this: pattern recognition, tracking inventory, organizing information. He took one of the folders, opened a statement from May of his 10th birthday, and began logging deposits. The government checks were easy to identify. Each one came on 3rd of the month, usually marked SSA Survivor Benet, Walker/Ethan followed by the amount. What was shocking, however, was how quickly the money left the account each month. Look at this, Ethan said, pointing to one page. $3,600 deposited on the 3rd. By the 10th, there's under $500 left. Kara leaned over. What were the withdrawals? He scanned down. Home Depot, Macy's, some boutique furniture place, and a recurring charge for a landscaping service. Then groceries. Only one charge at a grocery store. Kara opened her laptop. Compare that to what she claimed in the invoice. Food was a major line item. It's not there, Ethan said. Not consistently. And the clothes. She always told me I didn't need new ones unless mine had holes. They kept digging. June, July, August, all the same pattern. Money in, large. Discretionary spending out. No recurring rent payments. No consistent utility bills. No signs of financial hardship. Ethan began compiling a master spreadsheet month by month with 3 columns: deposit, major expenses, and remainder. By the time they reached the 5th year, The pattern was undeniable. "This is intentional," Kara said. She wasn't just mismanaging funds. She was living off of them, lavishly. Ethan clicked into a January statement and froze. "There's a $5,000 wire transfer here. Outgoing, labeled Honduras." Kara raised an eyebrow. She traveled internationally? She never mentioned anything like that. Ethan said, "But I remember she disappeared for about 2 weeks one winter. Told me she was visiting a cousin in Texas." Kara made a note. "We'll need to request additional disclosures. Wire transfers, travel expenses, any offshore holdings." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "She used me like an ATM, except the money wasn't even hers." It took them 3 days to finish compiling the full report. The spreadsheet Ethan built was 87 pages long, each one cross-referenced with scanned copies of the original bank statements. Kara added footnotes, color codes, legal annotations. Together, they built a timeline that showed not only the income and spending patterns, but a running total of unaccounted discretionary expenses. Final tally: nearly $190,000 spent on non-child-related items. The rest remained in limbo, either cash withdrawals, untraceable debit purchases, or vanished into accounts they couldn't yet see. Kara printed 3 copies and placed them in sealed folders. One for the judge, one for the Social Security Administration, one for their internal records. They submitted the files the next morning. Ethan didn't attend that delivery. He waited outside the courthouse, seated on a bench beneath a tree, just beginning to lose its autumn leaves. He watched them spiral down in slow, chaotic paths, wondering if this was what closure looked like. Not a bang, but a long, steady unraveling of every falsehood ever placed in his path. Kara joined him after the delivery. "They'll open a federal investigation," she said. "I spoke with the court clerk. The judge has already referred the case. Now it's in the SSA's hands." Ethan nodded. "What happens to her?" he asked. "If the agency confirms fraud, they'll demand repayment, possibly freeze her assets. If it's bad enough, they'll press charges." Ethan looked at his hands, then at the courthouse doors. "She'll never say sorry. Not once." "She doesn't have to," Kara said. "The numbers are doing the talking now." They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the city moving around them like wind. Ethan spoke again. "She wrote everything down, like I was a project, a financial equation. You were a child," Kara said firmly, "not a ledger. That's what the court sees now." Later that evening, Ethan opened his email to find a message from a name he didn't recognize. He nearly deleted it, but something about the subject line made him pause. Aunt Angela, from an old friend. He clicked it open. The email was short. "Ethan, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Calvin Marks. I worked with your aunt for several years. I heard about the court case. I'm sorry. I didn't know everything, but I always wondered. There's something you should see. I think it might help you." Attached is a file Angela left on the work computer when she quit. "I backed it up without thinking years ago. She said it was just accounting." Ethan downloaded the file. It was a spreadsheet. Another one. After the bank statements were submitted, a strange stillness settled over Columbus. Not silence in the usual sense, but absence of clarity, of resolution, of normality. The courtroom, the legal offices, even Ethan's own apartment felt charged with expectation, as though the truth was a storm gathering behind every door. Ethan spent more hours studying the spreadsheet files. He double-checked every month, every wire transfer, every miscellaneous category that had barely any detail. Every transaction seemed to reveal more than it should. He'd never thought money could burn so many holes through his past. Friends called, some supportive, some curious, others distant. None asked about restitution, only about how he was holding up. Sometimes he answered. Sometimes he just nodded and ended the call. He couldn't talk about it. He had to live through it first. During one evening, Ein, a colleague from the bookstore and someone Ethan had confided in, walked into his apartment unannounced. She had keys, spare ones Angela had given him years ago, before all this. She smelled like rain, weary but steady. "You disappeared after court today," she said, setting down a bag of groceries. "You okay?" He looked up from his laptop, where he'd just been highlighting wire transfers. He shut the screen. "I needed air." She nodded. "I get it. You don't owe her anything anymore." He shook his head. "It's not that simple." He paused and admitted she planned it. She accounted it. Every month she treated the benefit checks like they were hers, like she had a right to pick and choose what was mine. I sat next to him, then show people everything. He closed his eyes. "I will. It's just waiting for the court to catch up is harder than I thought." Ayn placed her hand on his shoulder. She didn't need to say much. That night, Ethan drifted into restless sleep and dreams of numbers, ticking clocks, ledgers shifting under hands. He woke before dawn and found himself unable to lie still. He got up, made coffee, sat in the kitchen. Dawn's light crept through the curtains. He stared at the wall, at the peeling paint, at the long cracks above the sink. All of it had been there during his childhood, but his perception was new. Now, he saw what had been ignored, what had been twisted in his memory, what had been framed to serve her. The next morning, a letter came from the Social Security Administration, brief, bureaucratic, confirming that they had initiated an investigation into possible misuse of the funds received by Angela. They requested additional evidence and clarified that their audit would include her bank statements, filed receipts, tax returns, travel records, and any documentation associated with her personal expenditures. They also noted that in cases of proven misuse, repayment could be demanded, plus penalties, depending on severity. Ethan and Kara read it together in her office. Kara closed the letter, her eyes tight. "They're moving faster than I expected." Ethan felt a mix of fear and relief. The fear of what else might come out. The relief because the system was finally acknowledging what he already knew. In the days that followed, Angela disappeared from the neighborhood circle. Her church attendance stopped. Neighbors reported she no longer came to the grocery store at the same hour. Her phone line, according to Kara's filings, had changed. She stopped answering letters. Kara warned Ethan she may be trying to delay, move things, transfer assets out of reach. "We need to establish freezing orders. If the SSA investigation confirms fraud, they may have authority. But anytime she hides something, it makes things harder." Ethan nodded. He felt anger at the possibility he would have to chase paperwork just to stop her maneuvers. But he also felt a growing resolve. He started logging everything else he could. Neighbors' accounts of her travel, witness statements, copies of checks she cashed, photos of her driving a car registered in her name, but bought just a few months after an expensive wire transfer. Then one afternoon in the courthouse basement, Ethan bumped into Angela unexpectedly. He was sitting quietly at a bench, reviewing files, staking out the clerk's office entrance to pick up another envelope. She came walking down the hallway, eyes red but composed. Her lawyer trailed behind. For a moment, their eyes met. She looked away. Ethan stood, heart pounding. She didn't stop. Her lawyer whispered something, and she quickened her pace. He considered calling after her, but didn't. It was an echo of past things, walking away. He stayed where he was, hands in pockets, watching her retreat through the courthouse doors. That evening, Kara told him the SSA had requested a meeting with Angela. The meeting would be confidential. She had the right to defend herself. But the summons was strong. Explain all expenditures, justify every wire transfer, every transaction that did not match the logs in her notebook. Angela responded through her lawyer. She denied wrongdoing, stated that expenditures labeled luxury were necessary in maintaining the home, that the wire transfers were gifts or family obligations, claimed portions of the ledger were estimates. She requested that certain bank statements be excluded on grounds of privacy. The SSA denied that request. They needed a full accounting. The tension in Ethan's chest tightened each morning. He wrestled with sleepless nights filled with uncertainty. What if the evidence wasn't enough? What if Angela had hidden more than they'd found? What if he was asking too much? But every time such doubts surfaced, he returned to the spreadsheet, the bank statements, the knitting pattern of duplicity. The evidence was there. Failure was only possible through ignorance or injustice. One evening, his phone buzzed. A text from Calvin Marks, The old friend who had emailed him. I found more receipts from overseas stays. She used her employment travel card for personal lodging. She logged it as regional conference. I'm sending scans. Attached were photos of hotel bills in foreign hotels, billing statements with her name and dates of stay that aligned with travel she had never disclosed publicly. On some receipts, she wrote in description, conference lodging or field trip per diem. On others, miscellaneous work expense. Ethan forwarded these to Kara. She leaned back in her chair, her face drawn. This is powerful follow-up evidence, she said. Now we're looking at documented falsification, misrepresentation. This could elevate a criminal fraud, provided we prove she knowingly misled or intentionally misclassified items. Ethan swallowed, breath sharp. She knew. She documented it. She planned it. Legally, we're solid. That night, Ethan found himself in his old room, his childhood bedroom in Angela's house, now cleared of his things, empty. He stood in the doorframe, looking at scuffed baseboards, sunlight through dusty blinds. Memories came flooding back. Struggling to sleep from cold nights, waiting for dinner, the sound of Angela arguing with neighbors about expenses. All those unspoken moments where he felt guilt for simply existing. But now, standing in that room, with proof that the government benefits had existed and been misused, guilt turned into loathing, not himself, but of what had been done to him. He pulled out his phone, reread the message from Calvin, reviewed the photos. His heart pounded with rage and something else, assertion, finality. He typed a message in his legal notes file. Full evidence for misappropriation, conference receipts, false narratives, wire transfers unexplained, all documented. Judge must see. He saved it, shut off his phone, lay down. Sleep came reluctantly, but this time, without guilt. Weeks later, a status conference was scheduled. Angela's attorney requested leniency, citing age, trauma, and that she believed she had acted out of duty. Ethan was asked whether he objected to dismiss certain receipts due to claim of personal privacy. Kara argued vehemently, presenting the new evidence from Calvin, tying together international lodging, hotel bills, hotel stays described as work travel, landscaping contracts, furniture purchases. Ethan sat through it, arms folded, listening to Angela's attorney pivot. Mrs. Walker did not believe she needed to declare all expenses to the government. She thought she was entitled. She thought Mr. Walker benefited from the house she maintained. Ethan felt every sentence as a lamp flickering out, exposing darkness behind it. When it was his turn, he rose, voice steady, even as it broke slightly. Your Honor, I recognize that for many people, duty means sacrifice. But duty does not mean exploitation. I do not stand here asking for gratitude. I stand here asking for accountability, because the purpose of survivor benefits is to protect a child who has lost a parent, not to become a personal bank. His words echoed. The judge nodded slowly. Angela, seated, looked at him briefly. Her face tightened. Her attorney tried to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. The tension in the courtroom was thick, as if the walls leaned in, waiting. The judge cleared his throat. I have heard all parties. I have reviewed additional evidence submitted, including new international lodging receipts, travel records, and receipts labeled under misleading categories. I find there is probable cause to believe misrepresentation and misuse of funds occurred. A quiet murmur spread. Angela did not cry. She did not speak. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders loosening a little. The judge continued. At this point, this court will issue an order of repayment for sums found to be improperly expended, subject to full audit by federal authorities. Additionally, the defendant's motion to suppress certain documents is denied. All records are admissible. The investigation by the SSA will proceed, and the findings may inform any criminal or civil penalties. When the gavel finally fell that day, it sounded less like an end and more like a crack, a breaking open. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Some asked about financial restitution. Others asked if Ethan was going to press criminal charges. Kara answered, "Those are decisions for the SSA and federal prosecutors." Ethan walked past it all. His face was calm, composed. He remembered what Einat said, show people everything. And he had. He didn't yet know the final sums. He didn't yet know if Angela would ever acknowledge wrongdoing. But the silence had broken, and tension, once suffocating, had turned into movement. The hearing room was packed. Word spread far beyond Columbus now. Blogs, podcasts, even small national outlets had picked up Ethan's story. It had been framed in countless ways. A moral parable about guardianship gone wrong, a cautionary tale about the misuse of federal support, or, more sensationally, a courtroom drama where the orphan nephew exposed his aunt's long-running financial scheme. Regardless of how people framed it, the public was watching. This time, the courtroom gallery was filled with observers, law students, local advocates, social workers, retirees, and journalists, their pens ready, phones silenced but screens glowing with anticipation. Ethan felt the weight of their eyes as he entered, but he didn't look toward them. His focus was forward, on the judge's bench and on what today might bring. Kara walked beside him, her briefcase tighter than usual in her grip. She had prepped him the night before. Today would not be another technical discussion of records or transactions. Today, the court had summoned both parties for final statements and questions before releasing its full ruling, and the judge had hinted, through the phrasing of his court order, that he had concerns requiring immediate address. Angela was already seated with her new attorney. The previous one had withdrawn representation after the SSA announced it would be pursuing charges pending further review. The man sitting beside her now was younger, more aggressive, and far less familiar with the subtleties of the case. Ethan could tell. The way he glanced repeatedly at his notes, whispered to Angela while flipping through the disorganized folders. It all signaled a lack of preparation, or desperation. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered and took his seat, surveying the packed room with a calm but stern expression. He wasted no time. This court has reviewed all submitted evidence and has also received preliminary findings from the Social Security Administration regarding the disbursement and use of survivor benefits issued to Ms. Angela Walker on behalf of Mr. Ethan Walker. Today, I will be issuing binding judicial orders in this matter. A murmur passed through the gallery. The judge didn't pause. But first, I must address a new submission that has been entered into the court record just yesterday morning. Ethan tensed. Kara turned to him, her brow furrowing. "New submission?" she whispered. He shook his head. They hadn't filed anything new. The judge continued. "Ms. Walker, your attorney has submitted an affidavit stating that the financial records previously submitted by Mr. Walker's counsel are, in your words, fabricated, misleading, and taken out of context. Do you stand by that affidavit?" The courtroom snapped into a vacuum of silence. Angela cleared her throat. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe some of the statements used against me have been altered or misrepresented." The judge leaned forward. "Do you have evidence to support that claim?" Her attorney stood. "Your Honor, we have not had time to procure forensic analysis, but my client insists." The judge cut him off with a raised palm. "Mr. Green, this court does not operate on insistence. If you are accusing the opposing party of document tampering or fraud, you must provide proof. Otherwise, your claim is not only irrelevant, it is contemptuous." Angela's face remained neutral, but Ethan could see it. The flush just beneath her cheeks, the panic she was trying to contain. The judge turned to Kara. "Ms. Whitaker, have you or your client altered or manipulated any of the submitted evidence?" Kara stood without hesitation. "Absolutely not, Your Honor. Every document came directly from subpoenaed bank records, federal benefit statements, and corroborated sources. Furthermore, several records were submitted by third-party witnesses, including a former employer of Ms. Walker's, with no contact or influence from our side." "Thank you," the judge said. He turned back to Angela. "This is your final warning. Any further attempt to discredit opposing evidence without merit will be treated as obstruction." Then he closed the file before him and took a breath. "This court finds that Ms. Walker knowingly misused survivor benefits intended for the care of Mr. Ethan Walker. Over the course of 10 years, she spent a substantial portion of these funds on personal luxuries, non-essential expenses, and unreported discretionary spending. While she did provide basic housing and minimal sustenance, these expenditures were grossly disproportionate to the amount received. He paused, glancing at Ethan. Mr. Walker, your composure throughout this case has been commendable. Your decision to pursue truth over vengeance is noted. Ethan gave a small nod but said nothing. The judge turned to the clerk. Read the court's final determinations. The clerk stood and began reading from the prepared order. Regarding the plaintiff's original claim of $30,000 in reimbursements, denied. Regarding the counterclaim of financial exploitation, accepted in principle. Specific monetary restitution to be determined following the full SSA audit. Preliminary estimate, $187,000 to be repaid to the United States Treasury. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery. Angela's new attorney jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is excessive. These figures. The judge slammed his gavel once. You will sit down or be removed from this courtroom. The lawyer sat. The clerk continued. Ms. Angela Walker is hereby referred to the Office of the Inspector General for possible criminal charges including, but not limited to, fraud, misrepresentation, and misuse of federal benefits. She is also barred from serving as a legal guardian for any minor or dependent adult for the duration of her lifetime. The words echoed like thunder. Angela's composure finally cracked. She stood suddenly, eyes wide. This is insane, she cried. I raised that boy. I gave up everything for him. You think I did this for money? I'm the one who sacrificed. The courtroom exploded in noise. Shocked voices, murmurs, phones being pulled from pockets. The judge struck his gavel repeatedly. Order! Order in the court. But Angela wasn't done. She turned toward Ethan. I cleaned your clothes. I cooked your meals. Your mother left you nothing. I was all you had. Kara reached for Ethan's arm, but he was already standing. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He looked her in the eye and said, calmly, so everyone could hear, and I was just a paycheck to you. Angela froze. You never hugged me, never asked how I was doing. You never once told me you loved me, but you made sure to log every cent you spent on cereal. The silence returned, but this time it was thicker, more final. The judge leaned into his microphone. This session is adjourned. The gavel fell one last time. Ethan left the courtroom surrounded by murmurs and flashes of light from nearby phones. But he wasn't listening. He wasn't looking back. As he stepped into the sunlight outside, the door behind him closed with a weight that felt like the end of something vast, something long overdue. In the days following the courtroom eruption, Ethan tried to return to a rhythm that resembled normal. But normalcy had become an abstract concept. The court's final ruling, the public spectacle of Angela's outburst, and the attention that followed transformed his once quiet life into something harder to recognize. People stared longer at the bookstore where he worked, approached him in cafes with half-hearted sympathy or curiosity disguised as concern. He gave brief nods, answered questions when necessary, but rarely said more than a few sentences. He didn't want to live in the story. He wanted to close it. The SSA investigation continued behind closed doors. The financial audit was underway. Kara informed him that once federal prosecutors reviewed the audit, they would determine whether to file criminal charges against Angela. Meanwhile, Ethan was advised to avoid any direct contact with her. That wasn't difficult. She had vanished. But just as the noise seemed to settle, an email appeared in Ethan's inbox that shifted everything once again. The sender was anonymous, the subject line unassuming. Angela Walker, trust documents. At first, Ethan assumed it was spam, or worse, a hoax. But the body of the email was brief and deliberate. She didn't just take the benefits. She hid what was meant for you. The attached document was created in 2011. Check the signature. You'll know it's real. Attached was a scanned PDF file, 3 pages long. The title read, Walker Family Trust, Beneficiary Addendum, Ethan M. Walker. Ethan opened it slowly, heart beginning to race. It was a legal document, notarized, dated 12 years earlier. It had been prepared shortly after his mother's death by the same law office that had helped finalize her estate. According to the text, his mother had directed that any life insurance policies, savings, or estate holdings be placed into a trust, with Angela listed as a temporary custodian, only until Ethan turned 18. The document clearly stated that upon reaching legal adulthood, Ethan would be entitled to full access to the trust's contents, which included assets from his mother's savings account and a life insurance payout totaling $72,000. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, Angela Walker. Beneath that, in smaller type, was a clause that turned Ethan's stomach. In the event the custodian determines that the beneficiary is not yet capable of managing these assets responsibly, the custodian may delay transfer until such time as deemed appropriate. No age limit, no oversight. Ethan stared at the screen, bile rising in his throat. The benefits weren't all Angela had taken. She had also absorbed what his mother had left for him directly, and buried it under a clause that allowed her to hold it indefinitely, a clause she had used to keep him in financial darkness long after he left her house. He forwarded the email to Kara with the subject line, "She never stopped lying." Her response came within the hour. They met the next day in her office. The PDF printed and highlighted. "This changes the nature of the civil case," Kara said. "It introduces an entirely separate breach, trust law. We can file a new claim. But more than that, if we can trace the original life insurance funds, it could become grounds for full restitution, plus penalties." Ethan leaned forward. "Can we prove she used it for herself?" Kara tapped the page. "We'll have to follow the money." The process began immediately. Kara subpoenaed the financial records tied to the original trust account. It took weeks to retrieve, and during that time, Ethan tried not to spiral into resentment. But he couldn't help it. All the years he'd spent scraping by, working late shifts, taking student loans, skipping meals, while a trust existed with his name on it. Money his mother had fought to leave him. Money Angela had taken with the same cold logic she used to log his cereal and pencils on Invoice. The record arrived. Ethan and Kara poured through them together. The trust had been active for 4 years following his mother's death. Then, in the 5th year, the entire balance, just over $72,000, was withdrawn in one lump sum. The recipient account, Angela's personal checking account. Kara set the paper down slowly. No reinvestment, no redistribution. She liquidated it. Did she declare it? No. It doesn't appear in her taxes that year, which means she committed not only breach of fiduciary duty, but likely tax fraud as well. Ethan stared at the number again, unable to process how much damage had been hidden in silence. "Can we file again?" Kara nodded. "We're past the statute of limitations for civil recovery on the trust, but fraud resets the clock. We'll file under intentional concealment and financial misconduct, and we'll notify the SSA that there's a new layer to their investigation." They moved swiftly. Within 2 weeks, a supplemental complaint was filed. The SSA, already deep into their own case, added the trust documents to their review. Ethan gave a new statement. Kara called it a formal post-discovery declaration. Ethan just called it the last page he would ever write about Angela. Then something else happened. A voicemail came through while Ethan was shelving books one evening. He recognized the voice before she gave her name. "Ethan, it's me." Angela's voice was thinner now, quieter. "I know you probably don't want to hear anything I have to say, but you need to understand, I never meant to hurt you. I did what I thought was best." There was a pause. "I thought if you had too much, you wouldn't fight for anything. You wouldn't survive this world. I had to teach you how to survive. That money, that trust, I didn't waste it. I just used it to keep everything afloat." Another pause. "If you want to talk, I'm at St. Luke's Community Center on Thursday mornings. They're helping me with legal aid. I'm sorry for everything." Click. Ethan sat still for a long time. He didn't call her back. He didn't erase the message, either. But it didn't change what had happened. It didn't change what she had taken, or what she had turned his life into. That night, he walked through his neighborhood, try and feel the air again, to breathe in something that wasn't courtrooms, legal briefings, or revelations of theft. Somewhere between the old library and the diner, where his mother used to take him on Saturdays, he stopped. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just stood there, still, listening to the world move around him. And for the first time in years, it moved without pulling at his throat. The final hearing wasn't announced with the same attention as the previous ones. There were no cameras outside the courthouse this time, no crowds leaning in for sound bites or reporters scrambling for quotes. The court had sealed this session at the request of both the SSA and the Office of the Inspector General. Too many documents, too many financial records, and too many personal details were now part of the official record. This wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about judgment. Ethan sat in the same courtroom, but the space felt smaller now. Not physically, just tighter, quieter, stripped of noise and performance. Kara sat beside him, her presence steady as always. They had reviewed the final filings the night before. The confirmation of misuse, the misappropriated trust funds, and the SSA's recommendation for restitution and further investigation. There was no need to argue anymore. Everything had already been said. Now it was in the hands of the court. Angela entered through the side door, escorted by 2 officers. Not because she was under arrest, but because a formal federal investigation was underway, and there had been credible threats made online once news of her fraud became public. Her eyes were sunken. She wore no makeup. Her hair was unkempt. Gone was the posture of defiance that had marked her earlier appearances. She looked like someone who had been waiting too long for a verdict she already knew was coming. Her legal aid attorney stood with a thick folder, not speaking, not trying to bargain anymore. The judge entered and took his seat without ceremony. He reviewed the room, then opened a thin binder that rested neatly before him. This hearing concerns a final judicial review of the financial misconduct case filed by Mr. Ethan Walker against Ms. Angela Walker, concerning the misuse of federally allocated survivor benefits, fraudulent misappropriation of trust assets, and breach of fiduciary duty. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers. This court has reviewed over 2,000 pages of documentation, including banking records, third-party statements, trust formation and dissolution documents, and internal communications obtained from Ms. Walker's former employer. We have also reviewed Ms. Walker's response filings and her testimony, as well as the findings of the SSA audit and the Inspector General's preliminary report. He paused. The findings are clear. Angela shifted slightly in her seat, but didn't look up. Ms. Angela Walker received an estimated total of $279,612 in federal survivor benefits over the course of 10 years. Of that amount, less than 15% could be directly tied to verifiable expenses for Mr. Walker's care. The judge turned the page. In addition to this, Ms. Walker was designated trustee of a private fund, the Walker Family Trust, established in the estate of the late Elizabeth M. Walker, Mr. Walker's mother. This fund, totaling $72,000, was legally bound for the benefit of Mr. Walker upon reaching the age of 18. Records indicate Ms. Walker liquidated the trust and transferred the full amount to her personal account without disclosure, consent, or reinvestment, and without any documentation indicating that the funds were used in accordance with the trust's purpose. The judge removed his glasses now. This court finds that Ms. Walker knowingly engaged in a sustained pattern of financial exploitation, abuse of fiduciary power, and deliberate misrepresentation of her legal obligations as guardian and trustee. A long silence followed. In civil terms, the court hereby orders the following. Ms. Walker is liable for restitution of $187,000 in misused federal funds and $72,000 in trust violations. She is further ordered to pay $15,000 in damages for emotional distress and violation of fiduciary duty. He turned to Angela's attorney. Counsel may petition for a payment plan, but failure to initiate repayment within 90 days will result in asset seizure and garnishment orders. Angela did not react. The judge turned to the final pages in his binder. Beyond civil damages, this court acknowledges a concurrent federal review. Given the evidence provided, this court supports a referral of Ms. Walker for criminal prosecution under Title 18 of the United States Code, including, but not limited to, sections pertaining to fraud, theft of government property, and tax evasion. He closed the binder. Mr. Walker, the court acknowledges your resilience and your pursuit of justice through legal, not retaliatory means. You are now formally released from any and all claims brought against you by the plaintiff. All records of alleged debt are hereby expunged. Your legal name, finances, and credit history will reflect this ruling within 60 days. Kara placed a hand on Ethan's arm. The judge stood. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell. Ethan didn't move at first, not out of shock, but because everything in him had gone still, like someone holding a breath for too long, and now try to remember how to exhale. Angela was escorted out of the courtroom, without a glance back. Later that day, Ethan and Carr stood outside the courthouse, watching the early evening sun scatter across the city. It was the first quiet they'd had in a long time that wasn't marked by fear or strategy. "It's over," she said softly. "No," Ethan replied. "It's just finished." They said goodbye, with plans to follow up on restitution details. But Ethan didn't linger. He walked the city without a destination. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt free. When he got home, he sat on his small couch and finally listened to the voicemail again, the one Angela had left weeks before. Her voice, her excuses, her version of love. And then he deleted it. He opened his laptop. No spreadsheets, no court documents, just a blank document. He typed a single line. "I was raised on silence." But the truth made noise. And I listened. 6 months had passed since the final gavel. The city had moved on. So had the headlines. What once filled every blog post and comment thread had dissolved into digital dust, replaced by fresher scandals and newer stories. But Ethan Walker's name still lingered in unexpected places. On whispered lips at legal conferences, in emails among social workers, in quiet forums where young adults try to understand a way to growing up unwanted, unsupported, and misrepresented. Ethan, for his part, had stepped back from public life, not out of shame or fear. He had simply had enough of being defined by what had been done to him. His legal victory had closed the book on Angela's manipulation, but not on the deeper questions he was now trying to answer. What kind of man did he want to be? What was he meant to build, now that no one could tear it away from him? The answer didn't come all at once. It came slowly in pieces. It came in a letter from a high school teacher he barely remembered, one who had watched him struggle in silence and finally understood why. It came in a message from a girl named Maribel in Montana, who had read his story in an advocacy newsletter and wrote, "I thought I was crazy until I read your words." It came in a coffee shop conversation with a former foster youth who recognized him and said, "Man, you didn't just speak for you. You spoke for all of us." And it came one night in the form of a check. The first restitution payment arrived on a Wednesday, certified mail, accompanied by a legal letter from the U.S. Treasury confirming the transfer. It wasn't the full amount. Angela had defaulted on immediate repayment, and the court had initiated asset seizure. But still it was something. Ethan looked at the total. $32,911. Money that had been his since childhood, lost in manipulation, now returned by force of law. He didn't spend it. Not right away. He let it sit in a separate account, untouched, not as a trophy, but as a decision not yet made. Instead, he focused on work, on building rhythm again. He kept his job at the bookstore part-time, but began volunteering in the evenings. At first, he helped a local shelter organize supplies for displaced teens. Then he started tutoring GED students on weekends. Then someone from the legal aid clinic asked him to share his story, confidentially, with young people navigating guardianship disputes. One night, after one of those sessions, a girl with tired eyes and a shaking hand stopped him at the door. "I thought nobody'd ever believe me," she whispered. "I know the feeling," he said. She started crying. He stayed. He didn't need to say more. That was when the idea began to take shape. Not just a shelter, not just a speech, but something longer lasting, a foundation, a place where kids like him, those left behind, used, silenced, could find legal help, housing referrals, and someone who didn't look at them with pity, but with recognition. Kara helped. So did Calvin Marks, the whistleblower who had sent Ethan the trust documents. So did Jonah, his old roommate from college. Piece by piece, they put the structure together. They filed for nonprofit status. They built a board. They started raising funds quietly through small networks. The name came naturally. Second Ledger, a quiet nod to the one Angela had kept, and to the one Ethan had rewritten line by line with the truth. By the time the first youth walked through the door, an 18-year-old boy who had aged out of foster care with no ID and no money, Ethan knew that something new had begun. Not a new life, not a reinvention, but continuation. Not as a victim, not even as a survivor, as a witness. Late one evening, after another long day of paperwork and outreach meetings, Ethan returned home to find a letter waiting at his doorstep. There was no return address, but the handwriting was familiar, tense, controlled, female. He opened it slowly. Ethan, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect forgiveness. I can't even expect understanding. But I needed you to know that I lost more than the money. I lost a story I told myself for years, that I did the right thing, that I raised you because it was noble, because I was good. That lie protected me from the truth. The truth is I resented you for being left to me. And then I turned that resentment into justification. I don't remember the exact moment I started seeing you as an account rather than a child. But I know I can never undo it. They're going to take more. I'll probably go to prison. I don't blame you. But I wanted you to hear me say the words I never had the courage to say before. I was wrong. Angela. He read the letter once. Then again. He folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but as a record. Not all truths had to be burned. Some simply had to be named. That weekend, Ethan stood in front of a crowded room at the city's Youth Advocacy Summit. He hadn't planned to speak, but the organizer asked, and when he looked out across the faces, young, old, searching, he knew he had something left to say. I used to think that silence was survival, he said. That if I stayed quiet, I could stay safe. But silence protects the wrong people. It protects the powerful, the ones who count their love in dollars and itemize lists. He paused. I lost a mother. I lost a childhood. But I didn't lose myself. The room held its breath, because someone taught me how to speak, not with kindness, but with accounting. And I used that language to say what I needed to say, to the courts, to the government, to the world. And now I want to teach others how to speak back. Afterward, as the applause faded and the crowd began to disperse, a small group approached. Teens, case workers, quiet listeners. Some held notebooks. Others just looked at him like they'd been waiting for permission to feel angry, to feel hurt, to feel hope. He stayed until the last one left. As the lights dimmed and the room emptied, Ethan stood alone on the stage, eyes lifted to the rafters, the echo of his words still lingering. He didn't feel victorious. He felt whole. The story was no longer about what had been taken. It was about what had been built from what remained.